Belterra Casino, Florence, Indiana, Ohio River. The casino. A view from Belterra Casino by the Ohio River in Indiana.
我实在讲啊，我的台语真含慢讲。但这个题目有当时是较复杂，所以我想要用英语讲会好无 ？OK， 使。所以我今仔日想要讲 ，I'm going to talk about U.S.-Taiwan relations going forward. But if you want to understand going forward, you have to understand the basis. 我想恁拢知影，这个台湾甲美国的关系根本的政策，不过咱来个继续讲一寡。Some key words that we must remember always: San Francisco Peace Treaty, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. We'll get to that one. And of course, the U.S. One China policy versus the One China principle of China, not the same. Here's Lao Cao Cao. In Cairo, meeting with FDR, President Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. And you might not know this, but Roosevelt thought that he and plus Stalin, the four of them, would be the four policemen after the Second World War, taking care of different areas of the world, trying to keep the peace. And that's why Chiang Kai-shek showed up, or he was invited. Winston Churchill didn't think much of him coming, but FDR wanted him there. And at that point in history, this is 1944, I believe, they thought that was going to be the way the war would go and it would be ended. But of course, you know the rest of that story. Chiang Kai-shek didn't make it very long. And of course, FDR died in 44. So Harry Truman took over. Harry Truman had this wonderful saying for Chiang Kai-shek. They called him President Cash My Check. Because all the money went there and they never knew what happened to it after it got there, right? So Truman did not think much very highly of Chiang Kai-shek. And there were lots of questions after the end of the war, what to do with Taiwan, within the U.S. State Department, within the think tank world. There were a number of ideas, right? One was the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, Chinese are going to win. Swaswaki, forget about it. It's not, it's not going to happen. Just let it go. Because, don't forget, Truman, at the end of the United States after the end of the Second World War, the last thing they wanted was another land war in Asia. So they thought, we're not going to go fighting the PLA over Taiwan. But some people said, well, wait a minute, Taiwan really belongs to Japan. Because at that point, there was not a peace treaty, right? So still officially, legally, Japan was the owner of the title. So the KMT was only given administrative control. If necessary, some people even thought we had to use force to get rid of Chiang Kai-shek, who by 49, as you know, was in Taiwan. There were some people that thought about a UN trusteeship for Taiwan. Had not been legally returned to China, and people had a right to self-determination. Right after the end of the Second World War, of course, most of these old former colonies were given the right for self-determination. Taiwan was a colony, right? So some people thought, let's give the people the right for self-determination. And of course, some people thought that, well, there's two Chinese states now. U.S., your diplomatically recognize both. But that's where Taiwan, unfortunately, BIA Nexu came into play. You know, remember Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State for Truman, drew this line. And the line was from Japan on the outside of Taiwan, on the inside of the Philippines and around. And he said, that's going to be our defense line, right? We'll defend anything to this side, but we're not going to worry about that side. And so it looked like, for all intents and purposes, Taiwan was going to be left to face the PLA army by itself. What happened? Of course, what happened was the Korean War. And so after the Korean War, let's see if I know how to do this. The line was moved from here to through the Taiwan Strait, right? And of course in Korea through the Taiwan Strait. What's interesting about that, the 7th Fleet, as you know, patrolled the Taiwan Strait. They patrolled it, in Truman's words, he didn't want the PLA to come across to Taiwan because he didn't want to, but he also didn't want Chiang Kai-shek going the other way, right? He didn't want to have to fight 2 wars because he was already fighting in Korea. So that war ended. It actually didn't end, of course. It didn't end until 53. 51 was the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Who was there to accept Taiwan on the part of China? Because remember, in Cairo, that picture we showed of Chiang Kai-shek, in Cairo they said, we're going to give back everything that Japan took, Formosa and the Pescadores, to China. The question was, in 1951, who was going to come and sit at the table when the peace treaty was signed? The Brits wanted China to be there, the PRC. The U.S. wanted the ROC to be there. They couldn't agree, so nobody would be there. So what happened was we had this famous line which says, Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to Formosa and the Pescadores, but there was no recipient name. Huh? From that point, this is a key point, from that point on, the United States has always accepted that the status of Taiwan is undetermined yet, right? Not yet determined, because there's no recipient. Chiang Kai-shek's there, right? KMT is there, squatting. Huh? U.S. isn't about to kick him out because they're having this battle in Korea. They don't want to start another front of the war. But that's an important measure to remember when you think about U.S. policy. But things change, right? Whereas Chiang Kai-shek and the U.S. policy was very anti-communist, what was the bigger enemy, China or the Soviet Union? Soviet Union. Right? And Mao Zedong and Stalin really weren't good friends. There was a lot of tension between them. And the U.S. knew that. So the U.S. thought, well, we could work a deal with the Chinese. And the first reason they wanted the deal was to stop Russian support for Vietnam. Russian support was coming through China into northern Vietnam. They wanted the Chinese help in blocking that. Because remember, Nixon, one of his key promises, it was going to end the war in Vietnam. And the war was going on, getting worse, in fact. So there's this great quote from Winston Churchill: if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make positive reference to the devil in the House of Commons. In other words, I'm going to need the devil against Hitler. I'll be willing to work with him. And in fact, that was Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger's vision of working with China. Get their help with the Vietnam War, and eventually, more and more, help blocking the Soviet Union. I would really recommend those of you that haven't ever read the memorandums of conversation between Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai. They're amazing documents. You can get, there's books on those, or you can get them online. In that conversation, Kissinger comes in. Zhou Enlai, as you know, is a very clever diplomat, smartest guy in the block. And Kissinger comes in and says to him, let's talk about Vietnam. What does Zhou Enlai says? No. We got to talk about Taiwan first, right? And the whole long sections of the conversation was about Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong trying to get Kissinger and Nixon to agree on a Taiwan policy which would get Taiwan back into Chinese control. And if you read those memorandums of conversation, you will see that Kissinger basically says, you know what, history is going your way. You'll get there sooner or later. Don't worry about it. And he says, in Nixon's second term, we'll get around to straightening things out. Well, what happened? Nixon's second term, right? He got foreshortened because he had to quit, right? So, but that's an important statement because the Chinese still have that in their pocket. But you told us in 1971 it was going our way. Hey, where are we at? So this is the fundamentals that you all know, but I just want to repeat them. I was repeated earlier. China's one China principle. Right? The communique, they listed what the Chinese position is, what the U.S. position is. The Chinese talk all about Taiwan being part of China. The U.S. side says what? We recognize the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. But the government of the United States acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. This is a key word here. When Secretary of State Martin Christopher went to the Capitol Hill to be interrogated by the congressmen who were worried about, what do we give away Taiwan? He said, no. Recognize means we recognize them. Acknowledge just means we heard what you say, we hear what you're saying, but we don't necessarily agree with you. The United States has never agreed to the statement that Taiwan is part of China. What we say is, like I said at the beginning, the sovereignty is undetermined. That is, it's up to both sides peacefully and mutually to agree on the status of Taiwan. And we've added afterwards, since then, it was presumed then, but because Taiwan's a democracy, that means the people of Taiwan have a right to say yes or no to any solution that somebody comes up with, right? It's not quite self-determination. That's what would be our concern, right? It's not that the people of Taiwan have the right separately and independently to declare independence, but they have a veto right over whatever is declared. And until the people of Taiwan agree to some resolution, according to the United States, the status will stay where it is, okay? These are the key points that keep coming up in the conversations. Taiwan Relations Act is, as you know, a very important piece of legislation that Congress put together after Carter recognized China to protect Taiwan and maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social economic system of the people of Taiwan. Now, again, legal words here. Maintain the capacity. Doesn't say we have an obligation, the United States has an obligation to fight on behalf of Taiwan, but we have to be ready. Ready for any eventualities. And of course, then there's the famous phrase where we will support defensive arms and services to Taiwan. In 1982, the third communique was written, which looked like the United States had agreed to stop selling arms to Taiwan. And Ronald Reagan, when he heard about really what was going on, said, wait a minute. He put together these 6 assurances which were delivered to Taiwan. And you can see what they all are, but the one I have underlined here, there has been no change in our long-standing position on the issue of sovereignty over Taiwan. That's an assurance to the people of Taiwan. We still believe, the United States, that the sovereignty question is not yet determined. Okay? So that's some of the history of the past. That's a very quick look. There's a lot to talk about there. If you have questions, we can go through it. Keywords today. Hillary Clinton talked about Taiwan being an economic and security partner. You have the rebalance, which has been the Obama administration's more or less recent attempt to look at Asia policy. And then you have a statement by Ray Burkhardt, the head of AIT, about the 92 was an understanding, not a consensus. This is Clinton's statement in November 2011. We remain committed to our one China policy, preservation of peace and stability. We have a strong relationship with Taiwan, an important security and economic partner. Those are powerful words from the Secretary of State. Not an ally, mind you, but more than just a friend. We applaud the progress that's seen on it. You'll hear the United States talking regularly. We like dialogue going on across the strait. We like peace and stability, but we're not going to give up on Taiwan. There have been analysts, Hakjia, say, oh, we should abandon Taiwan. Realists, China's big, Taiwan's small. What do you want to choose? Choose the big one. No. That's not U.S. policy. A little hard to read. This is a summary of the rebalance. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the rebalance, the pivot it was called originally. It's an important dimension to Obama's policy, trying to get disentangled from the wars in the Middle East and continuing to say, look, what's important for the U.S. in the future? Asia. Asia's where the people are, where the economies are, where the future is. We've got to have a strong policy in Asia, and it's going to demand a rebalance. Not just a military rebalance, although it'll be that, but also economic rebalance. That's what the Trans-Pacific Partnership is all about. Trying to knit together like-minded countries to provide an economic blanket as well as a security blanket for the region. It's not meant to be a containment of China, keeping China out. It's up to China if they want to get in, though. Okay? And you can see that in this acknowledgments of the rebalances from the State Department statement, we've made significant progress among the number of accomplishments we have, strengthened our treaty alliances, enhanced our defense posture, and deepened our partnership with Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and India, and strengthened our unofficial relationship with the people of Taiwan. That's in there. In the past, you might not have seen, you wouldn't have seen as many mentions of Taiwan as you see now in State Department statements, in even Defense Department statements. This important words that, I work in Washington, so in Washington, you watch every comma, right? You watch every separate new word that gets in it. These are important words. These are important underscoring that we have an unofficial, but it's a very strong relationship with Taiwan. Susan Thornton is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. She's, tell you a funny, not a funny story, interesting story. She gave a talk at Brookings, and when she gave the talk, she started off and it was at noontime, but we hadn't had lunch yet. She said, oh, I'm sorry, keeping you from lunch. She says, because, I know that Taiwanese say, and she said this in Taiwanese, Japon Hong Te Dua. And everybody went, whoa! Well, she lived in Taiwan, and actually her daughter was born in Taiwan. She was with the State Department there. So she really knows Taiwan, loves Taiwan. She's in a very important place now. And she had this to say about Taiwan in that same speech. Noted the administration's effort to strengthen and deepen the bonds, build a comprehensive, durable, and mutually beneficial partnership. We're working side by side to increase our mutual economic prosperity, tackle global changes, ensure effective security, to support continued stability and dynamism for Taiwan and the region. She repeated the belief that cross-strait differences can and should be resolved peacefully in a manner, pace, and scope acceptable to people on both sides of the strait. We will continue to call on both sides to engage in dialogue on the basis of dignity and respect after Taiwan's new administration takes office in May. This was said in February, I think it was. We'll continue to showcase the strengths and benefits of Taiwan's role and contributions in global efforts. And Ray Burkhardt is the head of the American Institute in Taiwan. That's our, in effect, the State Department for Taiwan, right? That's what AIT is. And he's the chair of the board. He's the Tualiap, right? And he said a couple months after Thornton's speech, he made this very important statement. He said, look, In the early years after 1979, the tendency was to treat Taiwan as an issue, okay, an annoying problem in U.S.-Taiwan relations. Frankly, and I think back, and he was involved with Taiwan for a long, long time. I think back myself to the people who worked on those issues at that time, and what they were thinking, and what they were saying, and the history books have opened up even more about that. Most of the people in the White House, in the State Department, at that time, they never imagined that we would still be talking about U.S.-Taiwan relations in 2013. They thought the issue would have gotten resolved, one way or the other, probably with Taiwan being absorbed by China. Huh? They certainly never imagined such a close and serious relationship, or that Taiwan would become an important player in the world trader system, an economic powerhouse that required a serious and important relationship. The Obama administration, building on the work of the Bush administration, has worked very hard to treat our relationship with Taiwan seriously, to treat it on its own merits. What he said in the Q&A was basically, look, in the past, Taiwan was an appendage, right, under the U.S.-China relation. The important thing was U.S.-China relation, and Taiwan was a secondary piece. Now we want to have two separate streams, the U.S.-China relation, the U.S.-Taiwan relation. See it, treat it on its own merits. Huh? Again, these are key phrases. And Burkhardt was also the one who did a video at Voice of America interview. It's online somewhere, you can look at it on YouTube. And he said, well, you know, I knew Ku Jianpu, and I was at a meeting recently where Doug Paul was there, and Steve Young, all of whom said, we all talked to Ku Jianpu. He never said 92 consensus. He said 92 understanding, right? So according to him, the United States doesn't believe there's a 92 consensus. There's an understanding, and that's kind of what Tsai Ing-wen said, remember? She said, there's a historical fact that people met in 92, and they came to some agreements, but they never came to a consensus that there was one China with different interpretations. So there was this, I think this is in Taipei Times, that's that little missile going through, as Ray Burkhardt's words about, there is no 92 consensus. There was a 92 understanding, maybe. And of course, Ma and our friends in China were not terribly happy about this. So that's where we've been in the past. That's where we're at today. Where are we going to be going forward? I know earlier, Professor Shim and others have talked about some of the issues about how we go forward from here. One very important document is this Global Cooperative Training Framework. It was a memorandum of understanding signed more than a year ago now between AIT and TECRO as the unofficially official bodies dealing with both sides, the United States and Taiwan. And I can tell you how important it is that one of the principal deputy assistant secretaries of state named Kurt Tong met in Washington, D.C. with Bruce Linghu, who was a deputy minister of foreign affairs, publicly sat at George Washington University and talked about this. Now again, so what's the big deal? Well, it's a big deal in Washington, right? That an official of the United States government and an official of the Taiwan government sat publicly and talked about joint programs. A sign, I think, of the warmth of the relationship, the depth of the relationship, and the constraints of the relationship, okay? Because this cooperative training framework is an attempt by the two sides to do training programs in Taiwan or elsewhere for people from Taiwan, from the region, and it'll be jointly sponsored with Taiwan money, but jointly sponsored by the U.S., AIT, and Taiwan. Acknowledging the excellent state, this is a long memorandum, I just picked out a few phrases. Acknowledging the excellent state of economic, cultural, and other relations between the people and the territories of the authorities they represent. In a roundabout language, right? Because we never say Taiwan, the United States, we never say Republic of China, say the Taiwanese authorities. Sorry, that's the way they talk, okay? And so this is a roundabout way of saying Taiwan and the United States. Recognizing the democratic, economic, and cultural development of people in Taiwan as a source of inspiration for other beyond. Recognizing the success of cooperative efforts between the authorities represented by the participants aimed at countering global epidemics, lessening the humanitarian disasters, as well as advancing environmental goals, energy initiatives. So those are 4 areas that they want to work on. Oops, sorry. Yeah. Health issues, humanitarian disaster. You know, in Lamdao, Nantou, there's a big center, a training center for people who do rescue missions. They want to bring people from ASEAN nations, come and learn how Taiwan has trained its people and train them more. Environmental goals. There's going to be a Clean Cities Conference in Seoul, I believe, at the end of this month. No, end of this year. And there'll be a UN-sponsored conference where Taiwan might or might not get in the door as Chinese Taipei. But there's going to be a separate conference, while all those people are there, on clean cities. I think that's the title of it. And Taiwan and the United States will co-sponsor that and invite people from around the world to come and talk about that program. So that's the kind of thing they're talking about. How do we make more space for Taiwan internationally? Not where you have to be recognized, quotes, as a state like you do in the UN or some of the other organizations, but where you can use Taiwan's resources, people, NGOs, etc., to really put forward Taiwan. And the hope, I think, and my hope is, if Taiwan's present at all these programs, does all these programs, it's not just in Asia, they'll do stuff hopefully with Africa and Latin America. Then when they're not there, people say, hey, how come Taiwan's not in the mix, right? They have a lot to offer. So again, it's not quite Michon, it's not quite the ideal we would like, but it's steps forward. So have we reached the following understanding? The participants have decided to cooperate in training individuals from outside their territories, providing other services outside their territories under an initiative called GCTF. If you're in Washington, you have to learn how to say all these acronyms real fast. GCTF. Say that 3 times, quick. Under the GCTF, the participants jointly determine the attendees for the training courses and the beneficiaries of other joint activities. The attendees can be nominated by their respective governments, by AIT, or by TECRO. The participants jointly approve all attendees and of beneficiaries. The areas of training courses are decided jointly by the participants. Initial areas of mutual interest for the program's initiation include global health, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, energy, science and technology, human security issues. Other issues can be mutually agreed upon. So again, this isn't recognizing Taiwan as a country, right? It's not what we would like to see, what I'm sure all of you would like to see. Not what a professor would like to see. It's not what most Taiwanese people would like to see. But it's a step for the United States, an important step forward in trying to open up the international space for Taiwan and for create Taiwan as a participant in this rebalance. Because the rebalance is trying to keep the peace and prosperity in the region intact, advance the prosperity by keeping the peace. And Taiwan can be a player in that. Okay? Take place either in the territory of Taiwan or the United States or other locations, etc. So it's a pretty comprehensive memo. And what I'm looking forward to in the future is that this pivot, this rebalance, will continue to strengthen. Okay? And again, the United States keeps saying it's not meant to be a containment of China, but meant to be strengthening the countries in the region. Obviously, a footnote is to resist Chinese pressure, South China Sea, East China Sea, economic pressure, by integrating people. And Taiwan, hopefully, will get more and more integrated into that partnership. Kurt Campbell, who was the Assistant Secretary of State under Secretary Clinton for the first, 4 years, I guess, I think so. He just has a book out, if you want to read it, called The Pivot. And it's a fairly comprehensive book. He talks about the American partnership with Taiwan advances U.S. economic and security interests, is rooted in shared values, will have a big impact on the way American partners and allies view the United States across Asia. So those people that say, well, we should just abandon Taiwan, response, very forceful response from most analysts and State Department people is, if we were to abandon Taiwan, what confidence would Japan have in us? Right? What confidence would South Korea have in us? What confidence would anybody have in us if we abandon a country, let me say country, right, as strong as Taiwan? So Taiwan's emergence as an economic powerhouse and liberal democracy is a testament to the fortitude of the people of Taiwan and the success of U.S. policy. Of course, we don't know who's going to be, we know who the nominees will be for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. We don't know who's going to wind up at the end of that long slog we have ahead of us as we go forward to an election. But I think if Clinton is the president, you'll probably have Campbell and other people who know Taiwan well in her circle, and I think the partnership and the rebalance will get strengthened. What Mr. Trump would do, I don't think anybody knows at this point. He could be a strong opponent. He could be doing deals with China. I don't know. I will tell you that I'm in Zudong, so I have to be careful. Don't listen to me too much about who the candidate should be. But I do think it's important to say this is embedded deeply, this partnership with Taiwan, embedded deeply in where the United States is today. The problem remains, however, that we still only have an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. Okay. We do not accept Taiwan as a 主权独立的国家, the way the DPP has it in its 99 resolution. Right? We would like that to be true. So there's still a long way to go forward. Building democracy in Taiwan, building support for Taiwan in this country. I'm sure most of you are American citizens as well as Taiwanese citizens. So the good work that Masao has done and others have done, getting Sherrod Brown engaged, getting Steve Chabot engaged, we got to do more of that as we get new congressional people. Because the Congress has always been very strong on Taiwan. The administration looks at it more from this larger perspective of we have, and this is important to understand, I think. Kissinger was so-called realist, right? He saw the world in power blocks, the United States versus Soviet Union. We had China as our friend to fight the Soviet Union. Many people thought, well, what happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed? How come we still kept this relationship with China? What I think the key element was that the Clinton administration believed that if we could get China in the World Trade Organization, right? He worked very hard to get that to happen. That China would grow economically, the middle class would grow, as it had in Taiwan, and the middle class would push for democracy. And that would solve the problem of a tense relationship with China. The problem is, of course, the middle class has grown to a degree in China, but Andy Nathan, professor at Columbia, has a very good article about who makes up the Chinese middle class. And when he pulls apart the strands, you find that many, many people in that middle class have a relationship with the CCP. Right? That's the way they get to be doing well. In whatever business, they may have a private business, but the Guanxi, Guanhei, keeps them linked. Or they may be members of the party of the government, local governments. So that vision of China, growing more prosperous and then growing, pushing for independence, because most middle class people don't like being told like they do in the CCP, like they did in Taiwan. That's part of what caused the uproar in Taiwan, right? We pay our taxes and you're not giving us our rights. What the heck? That's not the way it should be. Hasn't worked. So we're at this strange point in, I think, U.S.-China relations. Now remember, the U.S. still has lots of interest with China, North Korea. And anybody can tighten the screws on North Korea, it's going to have to be China. Right? And God knows, Kim Jong-un with ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons is not a pleasant idea. Climate change. That may seem like a far-off question, But for the Obama administration, that's a very important security issue. Why? Because if climate change continues and the disasters build up, what's going to happen to the movement of all the peoples? Bangladesh is going to have most people underwater. There's going to be intensive security issues as people have to move. So he's made that an important part of his portfolio, his legacy, and the Chinese have signed on to it. Now, whether they'll do anything, we could ask questions about that. So those two issues alone, let alone Iran, let alone questions of the Middle East where China has been willing to go along with UN sanctioned programs and stuff like that. So there's important elements between the U.S. and China that remain to this day. And that remains a background against which U.S. policy towards Taiwan is played. But of course, U.S.-China relations have become increasingly tense. South China Sea is the immediate focus right now. There's this tribunal going to give its test. It's going to give its decision tomorrow, I guess. Tomorrow or the next day, I forget. The 12th, I remember that is. What are they going to say? Nobody knows. The Chinese said they're not going to accept it. How's that going to work? What's the pushing and shoving that's going to happen in the South China Sea, as well as the East China Sea, where the Chinese continue to be very, very forceful and running their boats around that region. So there's a lot of issues on the plate between the U.S. and China. The U.S. does not want to see Taiwan become an issue again. They want to keep that peace and stability there, work on the other problems, but I think what I'm trying to tell you is I think U.S. is drawing Taiwan closer, giving it more profile, not quite the profile we would like to see. But I think going forward, the work that's being done in Taiwan to build democracy, build a democratic base, the work that you're doing here with your local representatives, your Zhongyiwan, Zhangyiwan, Jiqi, or in Kaliaogai, Taiwan, Henzai, Taiwan, in Tsuhua, or in Jiqi, Taiwan. 所以，我喜欢的意思话。